Thank you for attending our third installment of YWCA Cambridge's Knowledge and Action series. Today's event is a partnership between YWCA, the Waterloo Region Community Foundation, and Porch-Lake Counseling and Addictions Services. We will be guided through the data presented in the WRCF's recent Vital Signs report, led by lead researcher and author Steve Ayers of Common Good Strategies, followed by a panel discussion with Leanne Hundt, Executive Director of the KW Urban Native Wigwam Project, Rebecca Roy, Executive Director of Satellite Community Homes, Shannon Downs, Senior Lawyer and Executive Director of Waterloo Region Community Legal Services, and our very own Kate Taylor, Director of Programs at YWCA Cambridge. My name is Roz Gunn. I'm the Director of Communications and Advocacy at YWCA Cambridge, and I have the privilege of moderating today's event. So before I hand things over to Steve, I'd like to situate us by acknowledging the land on which many of us are joining virtually today. The land on which I live and the work that YWCA Cambridge is a part of is the land that belongs to and is the territory traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples. I acknowledge the enduring presence and the deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. Taking a moment at the beginning of our event to make this acknowledgement is an invitation for reflection and a reminder of the gratitude and accountability non-Indigenous people owe to the first people of this land. At YWCA Cambridge, we recognize that land acknowledgements are just one step on the path toward reconciliation. Reconciliation is about building relationships of trust, respect, and friendship. It is about acknowledging both the lived experiences of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and the experiences passed down through generations. Reconciliation rejects prejudice and requires that all of us on this land learn about Indigenous cultures, histories, and experiences, including the dishonor of treaties being part of both history and current day experiences. At YWCA Cambridge, we acknowledge that reconciliation must include walking alongside Indigenous peoples in this work as they lead the way. And now I will briefly outline some event expectations. So this event, as you know by now, is being recorded, so we will be able to share it after the fact. It's meant to be a learning opportunity. So we're here to create a space conducive to having a fruitful and respectful conversation. And to that end, we will be monitoring this event and the chat throughout to ensure we can maintain that space. And it looks like most of you got the memo, but if you are not a panelist, we ask that you please turn your camera off. And this is just not because we don't want to see your faces, but just so we can see exactly who is speaking. And if any questions come up for you throughout today's discussion, including throughout Steve's presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function. And we hope to have time at the end of this session for tackling at least some of them. And I thank Steve, Rebecca, Leanne, Shannon, and Kate for being here and willing to share their insights, and you, our audience, for joining us today. Now, at last, I'll pass things off to you, Steve.
And thank you so much. Today, I'm going to walk you through some of our findings from our vital signs for Waterloo Region on affordable housing. And today we're going to take a particular focus on some of our insights from Cambridge. Some of these go beyond the scope of what we covered in the original report, and some of them are more updated to reflect where things are at now versus the several months ago when we first published. So I'm going to start walking through a couple different pieces. I'm going to start by talking about housing. And just because we can take a lot of housing data, put it both in international and national context, see just how much home prices have gone up locally, and what are some of the implications for many of the most marginalized and vulnerable in our cities. And then we're going to take a focus on what that's meant for renters in the region, and talk about some of the other implications and challenges that have emerged because of these emerging affordability issues around housing. Today, I also want to thank our sponsors and supporters who helped make this Vital Signs report possible, and look forward to diving into things. And again, please do put any questions in the chat or question Q&A. I will, at the end of the presentation, I'm hoping to have time, but if there's anything I can answer quickly throughout, once I finish speaking, I'd be happy to answer anything that I can just in terms of text. So one of the first things we talked about in our report was talking about supply and demand. And we called this, our first chapter was Navigating Housing in one of OECD's fastest growing regions. And when we look at Waterloo Region in an entirety, we see that the pace of growth was actually pretty staggering if we look from 2015 to 2022, the most recent areas we had data. Waterloo Region grew by about 17%, which is about twice as fast as Canada overall. And which is about 3 times faster than the typical OECD country, just when you look at Canada's growth. So it really puts the amount of growth that's experienced in the region in context. So even Cambridge's growth, which has been slightly slower than Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo metropolitan area's growth, which is really the growth was driven by considerable population acceleration in Kitchener and Waterloo. Even that, when you look at an international context of what's the typical proxy for other countries, you see that this is a really high amount of growth. And of course, with that comes increased demand for services as more folks move into the region, and increased challenges of as we make sure that everyone has adequate services of all kinds. And of course, it comes as well with challenges in terms of the entire continuum of housing, making sure that folks have access to every type of housing they need. In terms of some of the other stuff, in the full report, we focus a little bit more on terms of the supply and demand equation. Today, I'm going to move right into the pricing side of things and to really talk about affordability. In the next chapter in our report, in each case, you can see more data by going to the corresponding chapter with the same title. We talked about how Waterloo's prices have gone up more than nearly anywhere else in the world. So this data going back to June 2023 shows data for both Kitchener-Waterloo and for Cambridge. But basically, when we look at prices in this region have gone up about 60 to 70 percentage points faster than the rest of the country. And they're certainly amongst the fastest growing places across the entire country in terms of home prices. When you look at the most recent data we have, we see again that Cambridge is still about 65 percentage points faster price growth than the rest of the country. Where that really starts to hit home is when we compare to an international context. Data from The Economist show us from over the same time period we cover in this chart, from 2005 to about until the end of 2022, home prices in Canada grew 4 times faster than the typical OECD country. So we have our region and Cambridge and the rest of the region are growing much faster than the rest of the country. And we have our country's prices growing much faster than most other developed countries, which really speaks to the particular challenges that we're facing in this region, coping with the extreme pace of home price growth. And we start off here by focusing on housing prices. And we're going to speak to what this means for renters, which are many of the more marginalized and vulnerable folks within our society. But I did want to start off with this international comparison because it really does highlight just how challenging the environment has been in terms of home price growth and rent price growth compared to most of the rest of the world. And a lot of the news stories most recently have been focusing on how home prices are going down. And we don't have as much great data from that in terms of rents of what it looks like, very fine-tuned in the most recent months. But when we actually look at whether people's mortgages are going down for people who are buying new homes, we can see that mortgage prices are actually, even as the prices are taking historic drops, which is what many of the headlines are about, mortgages are no less affordable than they used to be. So, of course, mortgages are particularly important as well for renters because many people are buying these in order to rent. So as those prices go up, those costs will get passed down to new renters as well. So I did want to emphasize, even as we're talking, it's been a lot of times in local headlines recently talking about the price decreases. It hasn't translated to any increase in affordability for anyone who's trying to purchase a home. Next, I want to focus on the rent picture, which really in many cases reflects many of the most vulnerable folks in our community. And when we look at the increase in rent, it hasn't gone up quite as much as as home prices, but we see that it has had staggering increases, particularly in recent years. We don't have great data in terms of what the rent of a vacant unit looks like in Cambridge versus the rest of Waterloo Region. But when we look across the region, we see that rents have gone up by about 141% since 2008. If we were to do a comparable for income, income might have gone up about 40 to 50% over the same time period, really reflecting how this is people are getting further and further squeezed. And the line here for purple shows the rent of vacant units. You can see, particularly in the last 6 or 7 years, rents have really accelerated in terms of if you're trying to go out in the market and get a current unit, that's where we see the biggest level of acceleration. When we do look at Cambridge, it is slightly more affordable on the rental side of things. About rents on average are about 9% lower, but that does reflect the lower growth does come with fewer new units, and a lot of those units are being rented at much higher average rents. So it's hard to say to the degree to which a direct comparison of what's rent look like in Cambridge versus the rest of Waterloo Region. But no matter what way you look at it, things have been increasing at a staggering rate. And when we look at how does this compare to income, particularly for those who identify as women on the census, we can see that the gap has become quite dramatic. And so if you're looking at that 1,864 figure from the previous slide of the typical rent of a vacant unit, that requires about $75,000 in household income. When we look at the typical person who identifies as a man, the income is about $49,000. The typical person who identifies as a woman, about 37,000. So it really speaks to the gap that everyone is facing, but particularly women are facing in the region, as it's no longer really easy for someone to be able to afford a rental of a unit, even with two incomes. It can be quite challenging to even afford units. And if you add kids into that scenario, it really starts to show how, for many folks, even the most basic things of providing being able to afford rent has become further and further out of reach. And one of the things we do talk about in our full report is really the need when we're dealing with such massive population growth on an international or national comparison, the need for more rental units. And while this is absolutely critical, it's also really important to emphasize how this is essential, but not adequate to address the affordability gaps we're seeing. When we look at prices in over of units built in the rental units built since 2015, the typical units renting for almost $2,300. So again, while we do need these units across the entire region, because the population is growing so rapidly, it's also this will not by itself make much of a difference on affordability. It will certainly potentially prevent prices from accelerating further, but in of itself, the prices of these units that are being built are even higher than the typical prices, which really speaks to the gaps we've seen. One of the biggest concerns we have, again, looking at data across Waterloo Region, is just how much acceleration we've seen in what used to be the most affordable units. When we look at apartment buildings built before 1960, in just 5 years, we saw a 75% increase in average rent. And one of the things I'm sure that we'll be speaking about in the panel is the necessity of making sure we preserve affordable rental units. Because we can see that rents are accelerating across the board. But where we see the most drastic acceleration in rents is these older units, as people are, every time someone gets kicked out of a unit for whatever reason, whenever there's that opportunity to evict someone or someone leaves of their own volition, the prices of those are going to be drastically increased. So when someone leaves, we see this really, really staggering increase because there are, of course, many limits in terms of what people can increase if someone stays in a unit. But as soon as someone leaves, these units are often being put on the market 75% higher than they were. And this is really meaning that there's very, very few options available for folks. It used to be these older units were the essential way that many of the most vulnerable folks in the community, most marginalized folks in the community were getting by. But they're no longer available. There's just really almost no units renting anymore that are affordable to the folks at the bottom 20-25% of the income distribution. And when we look specifically to Cambridge, when we do speak to that need for more rental units, I mean, it is so this data from CMHC's rental market survey shows that very, very few rental units are being created. And we certainly spoke on the previous slides about how this is far from adequate in addressing the rental crisis, but certainly rental units are needed for a healthy market. And something particularly in Cambridge, we see there's a massive gap in terms of there is a lot of need for rental markets, particularly primary rental units in opposed to condos, and very, very few have been built in the last few years. Another thing we spend a lot of time on the report, and I'm only going to touch on it briefly, is the concept of how all of these changes have related to changing composition of households. And we call our chapter expanding households, shrinking spaces. And I'm going to talk a little bit less about how our spaces are getting smaller as more and more of the units being built are small condos. But I do really want to emphasize, like, these affordability challenges have drastic implications on how people live. When we look at between 2016 and 2021 across Waterloo Region, what are called suitably housed households grew by 8%. So, I mean, if you're going to do like a layperson's definition, that would mean that households that are not overcrowded grew by about 8%. Over the same 5-year period, overcrowded households grew by 46%, 6 times faster. And we look at the most severe shortages when units where there's or households where there's a 3-bedroom shortfall. Based on the relationship of the various people living in the household, we see a 104% increase. So as more and more people are moving to the region, of how they're often compensating for these increasing prices by living in increasingly crowded circumstances. And this has a lot of implications for things like hidden homelessness. So if people may not be living on the streets, but they may be living with folks in an environment where there really isn't an adequate number of space. They may be couch surfing, going between units, between different homes. And I think this piece on overcrowding, which we spend quite a bit of time looking at some of the nature of it, really speaks to some of the stats that are less often captured, but really speak to the challenges in circumstances a lot of people are forced to live in to compensate for these rapidly growing costs that we've been talked about so far. The next piece we talk about a bit more in the report as well is what we call blueprints of belonging, and how these sorts of implications and challenges have impacted belonging in our community. When we look at sense of belonging overall across Waterloo Region, and we don't have data specifically for Cambridge, but we do see that sense of belonging overall in the Waterloo Region is about 5 to 7% points below the national average. Oh, and there's a particular divide between renters and owners. We see that renters have a much lower sense of belonging and a much lower rate of neighborhood satisfaction, which does speak to, as a lot of these affordability issues become significant, it has a lot of implications on people's life satisfaction, their rates of depression, their sense of belonging to the community, how much the services in the community are meeting the needs. And so obviously there's a lot of things we need to figure out when we look at what the affordability is going to do for folks. How do we ensure that people have enough money to provide adequate housing for themselves and any family members, and as well as like make sure they can still afford food while they're doing that. But there's also all sorts of other implications that we need to think about the ripple effects on the community as we look at what's going on in the housing market. The last piece we talk about in the report is what we can look towards for solutions. And one of the things that's been a traditional solution for a lot of these challenges has been community housing. And when we look at this chart here, which shows in the turquoise line, the number of households on the wait list for community housing, and on the pink line, the number of households housed, we can see the gap has become tremendous. I mean, it used to be a decent portion of folks on the community housing wait list were housed every year. Almost a quarter when we look even back like a few years ago in 2015, houses were housed each year. When we look at the most recent year, there's 28.5 times as many folks living in community on the wait list as are housed. So fewer and fewer people are being housed each year. There's certainly been a couple initiatives to try and increase subsidized housing that are on the way and will have some impact, but just how the gap has just become larger and larger because the surge in need versus our ability to provide new housing has really got disconnected from each other. For women, this has a particular challenge, as women are most likely to be those relying on subsidized housing, particularly women who are leading lone parent families. And so when we look at, women are about 1.7 times as likely to live in subsidized housing in Cambridge as men, and a big portion of that is women with young children at home. So when we look at like what is the option for those folks now, you might be waiting years and years and years before you get through a subsidized housing unit. And I mean, it could be a decade for folks at this point. And so it really does speak to some of the challenges when we look at like how do we ensure that many of the most folks who need this most are provided it when there is so little available compared to the number of folks who need it. When we look across the country, we see that our subsidized units are relatively uncommon in Canada versus most countries. When we look at Canada versus the OECD average, our subsidized housing units are about half what we see in other countries. And particularly now that we see these really drastic increases in prices in Canada versus other regions, that gap and the lack of subsidized housing units really starts to hit home because we haven't been investing for decades in the adequate infrastructure to support this sort of pricing. And yet we've seen the pricing go up more than nearly anywhere else. So we really are so far behind in a lot of ways in terms of being able to adequately support some of the most marginalized folks because we haven't been making these investments over recent decades. Cambridge does have slightly higher rates of subsidized housing than other parts of the region, but certainly, again, it's nowhere near adequate to those challenges we've raised throughout this presentation. We summarize a couple of the potential solutions across the report and some of the issues. I mean, and we see like obviously, everything we're talking about, there's massive issues. If we dive more deeply into any of the reports, and if you have any questions, we can certainly talk about some of the other ones we also raised. But there's a lot of issues, and it needs investment by all levels of government. It needs partnerships between nonprofits. It needs partnerships between companies. Like we really need an all hands on deck solution for this. And when you look at public polling, like there's a lot of support for initiatives to really make an impact in this. I mean, certainly when we get to like the cost of them, it starts to get a bit more challenging. But the public wants action, and they're not seeing it. And so I think that's a really, I mean, critical thing when we look at all levels of government is like the public does have a lot of support for the concept of trying to do a lot more than we are currently. And it's clear, when we look at everything from support for homeless shelters to increases in subsidized housing to just the existence of rentals housing in general, like it's clear we need more supply across the entire spectrum of housing. And really, when we look at those, one of the biggest concerns we had was the loss of the most affordable units. I mean, those units being built between 1960, I mean, 5 years, a 75% increase in average rent. I mean, this really means that one of the most critical stopgaps for those who are struggling has gone away. And I think, really trying to think through a real strategy across the region of how do we preserve affordable housing units so we don't continue to see this acceleration, particularly at those most affordable units, but really across the spectrum is, I think, one of the most critical. And we really do speak in the report about the ripple effects of what does this mean for everything else in our community, from community infrastructure to belonging, to mental health, to financial security. When people can't afford to live here, like what does that mean for jobs in the community? How do we ensure that there's enough folks who can afford to live here to provide critical services? Housing really does ripple into every other aspect of our community. And certainly, I think that's important to keep in mind, both in terms of what does it mean in terms of if we don't make the investments, but also when you think about all the different ways that we need to ensure, as we're dealing with a rapidly growing population, how do we make sure that people get the supports they need to settle here and live here and thrive here and all these other pieces. And so we certainly spend a lot of the time on any of these pieces. You can see more in the full report. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address them at the end of the presentation or through the Q&A box while the panel's speaking, or do feel free, you can email me as well if you want, and I'd be happy to go through anything.
Steve, thank you so much. Very thorough painting of what is a pretty grim picture. We're going to move into the panel now. And with this panel discussion, I'm hoping it adds a bit more texture, I guess, to this picture that Steve has painted. So I'm going to ask Kate, Leanne, Rebecca, Shannon, all of you, yep, to put your cameras on and unmute. Or, I mean, mute if you want to mute until you're speaking. I know someone among you has a yappy dog, Kate. Okay, thank you so much, Steve. And thank you once again to the panelists for being here today. So this first question is for all of you. And of course, feel free to rip off some of the things that Steve has said. I mean, for me, one of the most poignant was just his point about how housing ripples into every aspect of our community. And I think that's really going to come through in your responses in this discussion. This first question, from the perspective of your work, what are some emerging or persistent issues you're seeing in the community that are impacting your organization's work and more specifically your prevention efforts? Whoever would like to go first. Rebecca, or Shannon, Leanne?
Yeah, I can go. Thanks. I'll go, Shannon, and then you can follow. Thank you, Roz. And I just wanted to say to everyone, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And it's really great to come together and talk about these issues. I work in affordable housing, so my perspective is a little bit different, but we are still working on prevention efforts that, with our current tenants and making sure that we have some movement because, what we heard earlier was that we have about 7,600 folks on a wait list and we were only housing less than 300 annually. So that's really concerning. For me, what I've experienced since moving into the sector, in particular in Cambridge, is the difference between the political will in terms of moving this forward and really achieving the work that needs to be done and in a much more efficient and timely manner. So I would say, number one, that kind of underpins everything. But it stems, as we talk about social determinants of health, it's all of those components, right? It's the lack of primary care, long wait lists for mental health services. What sort of labor market opportunities are there? Are all of our opportunities at local colleges going externally? We need to look at all of these things, education, housing, health, that factor into this. Inadequate income supports. These are all factors that prevent people like the individuals and families that are living in our housing communities from actually being able to build assets and then move on, because there's a lack of then affordable non-community housing available for people to go to. So I'll leave it there. I have a lot more, but I'll just hold it there so that other people can have an opportunity. Shannon?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one of the things that we're seeing, and we assist people on a daily basis with evictions for a variety of reasons. But what we're seeing is that there are a lot of people who come to us because they're struggling to pay their rent in and they're renting unaffordable units. So we have this big gap where there's, like Rebecca mentioned, about the wait list for community housing or subsidized housing. So a lot of people who are on low incomes end up paying market rent. That rent has just been going up so dramatically that you see a lot of people at the low end of the market who are, maybe they're getting a roommate and they're trying to find a place to rent. Even doing that sort of thing, they're still finding themselves paying almost all of their income to rent, which means that something has to give. And so if if something happens to them where their income, they don't have income for a month, if they're working, if they're off sick, or if they have extraordinary expenses, they get into arrears. And when people are coming to us, their arrears aren't, a few $100s or a couple $1,000s. They might have $15,000, $20,000 in arrears, which is really difficult to get to help people work through. Then if they are getting evicted, their options are so limited in the market that often what we're seeing is people saying to us, look, if I get evicted, I'm going to be homeless. I'm going to be going to a shelter. I'll be moving into a tent. There are just zero options in terms of the deeply affordable rental units that are available on the market. So, you have this combination of more people getting evicted for economic reasons and a huge gap in terms of affordable options once they're facing eviction. So that makes our job really difficult, because if people don't have those options to go to once they're in evictions, and we can't, if someone's got $20,000 in arrears, and they can only afford to pay it back at $200 or $300 a month, if that, the reality is they will get evicted. So it's a real, it's like a tsunami of bad events that are happening to people, and it's really insurmountable. So I think that's, years ago we would have been able to say, well, it's unfortunate you've gotten into those arrears. Hopefully we can get some money to help you pay them back. But if the magnitude is too big, that's just not an option.
Shannon, Leanne or Kate, would you like to?
Yeah, I can probably take this in because I agree with everything that the other folks have been saying. I mean, money has always been one of the things that my community's been facing. But I think right now, one of the biggest things that's going on in our community is that sense of identity and that sense of belonging that I've seemed to notice. Like most of our housing right now is individual homes, and we're scattered. We're scattered all over the place. And so that sense of community isn't there. The understanding working with Indigenous people has been something that not a lot of folks have a clear understanding of. And I think that some of the traumas that a lot of our folks are going through translates back into they don't ask for help when they need it. They don't have necessarily the sense of pride in their homes that maybe prevents them from doing their own maintenance sometimes. And so that education piece, that sense of belonging, that sense of owning their own space and being proud of that space and asking for help are some of the really big things that I'm seeing as, they get to that point and it's so far gone that it's really hard to support. And so that's one of the things that I think we try to do a little bit differently, staying on top of some of those things. But that sense of community is huge. And we're seeing that, because all of our places are single family homes and they're far apart from each other. With the housing that we're having in Cambridge, where everybody's going to be in the same space, we're seeing a lot of excitement around that, and a lot of folks where they're going to be able to find folks that they can lean on, and that sense of community is really huge. And we're hoping that is a big part of some of that prevention work that we're hoping to accomplish. So thank you.
Nodding along in validation. So thank you for inviting me into this conversation, Roz. I think through the context of our programs, we continue to see the ongoing impacts of the pandemic and the recovery, that isolation, the disconnection that Leanne's speaking to and that Steven spoke to as well. And in line with the ongoing conversations related to the need for increased affordable housing options and support for our unhoused neighbors, it really comes down to increased and persistent barriers for the, that folks are facing right now. And because we follow a participant-led approach to programming and support for participants, meeting folks where they are and offering support in locating these resources and beyond our programs to support with the self-identified barriers becomes a major focus of the work that needs to be done first to ensure our participants have access to the things that they need so that they can fully participate and find that belonging involved in our programs. So much of that work continues to be focused on supporting participants and their families in accessing essential needs. We all know you can't fully engage or you can't take those necessary next steps when your basic needs are going unmet. So for us, it's access to food, clothing, shelter, funds, all of those things essential in our programs and beyond so that they can sustain themselves and their families. So then we can look at what our programs can offer in terms of that pre-employment, the employment reskilling, the financial literacy, or just being a youth, having fun and engaging in community-based programs. So I think we're seeing a lot of what other folks are seeing here. We've heard it in increased rates of GBV, violence, discrimination, overall lack of mental health and well-being, and little choice in the safe, affordable housing, and then homelessness. So many are navigating those landlord issues, which were brought to us first with the Tiger Lofts community in Cambridge, the building on Main Street, which had sold. And there were many folks that were just searching for answers as they were receiving notices, offers for buyouts to leave their units and there's nowhere else to go, as we've heard. So staff really became system navigators, like spending time directly with participants, gathering the information, helping them to, attending meetings with them, connecting them with advocates and regional staff who could better guide them to find the answers that they needed. So these are really the growing concerns for folks who are precariously housed in our programs or facing homelessness, who are looking to move or unable to find affordable units and remaining in unsafe situations. So without someone to help them kind of navigate all this and not having those basic needs met, programming is secondary, and the need to move upstream and address this work through prevention is just becoming more urgent.
Thank you, everyone. It's a good segue into our next question that has a little bit more to do with prevention. What are some of the things that you do or others, and this is for Shannon, Leanne, and Rebecca, what are some of the things that you do or others can do to protect existing affordable housing? This can be policy levers, advocacy, relationship building, what have you.
So I can start off by talking about, one of the issues that I think Steven's report really showed is the issue around older housing stock and the rate of increase, the rent increase in that older housing stock. And I think a lot of that has to do with the trend that we've seen related to rent evictions and demolitions of older housing stock. So that's where, a property developer maybe buys up an older building, something like the Tiger Lofts. Often there's cash for keys being offered. So the existing sitting tenants are offered cash to essentially move out voluntarily. Or if that doesn't work, then there's processes at the landlord tenant board that a new owner can go through, or an owner can go through to make the tenant move out essentially while they're doing the renovations in the unit. There's some really interesting things that are happening in different communities. The city of Hamilton is a recent one in terms of trying to create some new some protections for tenants who are facing rent evictions, which are really ensuring that people aren't forced to move out if the work being done in the unit isn't extensive enough that it really requires them to. So sometimes these processes are being used as a way to get rid of sitting tenants who are paying more affordable rents. And so, these additional protections that the municipal level, I think are going to be really, I hope they're going to be really effective. And I think it's really interesting to see what some different municipalities are trying to do in that area. Because those are the units where, you know, because we have a system in Ontario of vacancy decontrol in terms of rents, which means that once the tenant moves out and isn't coming back, a landlord can raise the rent to whatever level they want, whatever the market rent is. And so those are the units where we really want to make sure that people aren't losing those units without, you know, because then they're being pushed out into the market and they're facing much higher market rents. So I think that that's one of the policy issues that I think could be really effective.
If I could just interject, and Shannon, as you're speaking, nodding in agreement, I'm sure you hear from time to time individuals saying, it's my unit, it's my home, I own it, I can rent it for however much I want. Do you have a response or
Yeah,
an
I mean,
analysis?
I think, you know, I think I've you know, had a lot of clients who are tenants who have rented their units for multiple years. We had a situation recently where a landlord was trying to rent-evict tenants, and there were families where they had lived in these units since their kids had been born, and their kids were now teenagers. I mean, it's equally, it's their home. We have protections in Ontario for tenants that, you know, that limits the circumstances in which a landlord can legally evict somebody. And I think really what I'm saying is we need to make sure that landlords aren't taking advantage of loopholes, which are, you know, essentially the market has created a big incentive for landlords to try and get rid of sitting tenants who are paying what are reasonably affordable rents because they're subject to rent control. And then once they get them out, they can turn around and rent it at market rent. So we have to make sure that that's not happening in circumstances where it's not, the law isn't really designed to allow it to happen, but that landlords are sort of subverting or taking advantage of loopholes to get those tenants out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to ponder. I mean, financialization of housing in Canada is worse than as Steve's presentation really showed. So yeah, what are these factors at play here? Anyone else would like to chime in? Please go ahead, Rebecca or Leanne.
I can just talk a little bit from a affordable housing provider perspective. Basically, the way, you know, I try and operate is to look at any kind of exercise or energy that puts additional revenue within our organization or additional savings in our budget. So for example, you know, we oversee about 1,100 units right across the region. And so how do we protect that affordable housing stock to make sure at least those are available if we're not able to develop more? We just opened a new building, but we probably won't be able to do additional development for another few years. But there are opportunities out there that we need to take advantage of that we know about through you know, our relationship with the service manager. So I would say relationships are really important because that's where you learn about incentives or rebates around like energy efficiency that you can do for your buildings so that the cost of operating them, LED conversion, you know, there's a lot of money that we spend over the course of a year in just the maintaining of the actual physical properties in the buildings and the capital needs that we have. So there are lots of incentives right now, even through companies like Enbridge that are willing to come out and provide an assessment of your facility without actually charging you anything. And then there are incentives to work with them. But I really think there are opportunities now for, you know, like if Leanne and I, if our organizations, if we wanted to come together, we could look at a partnership opportunity where different nonprofits come together and look at how did we collectively work together to do this. So what may not be done by one individual organization or group may be able to happen with people coming together for partnerships. There's lots of things out there. For instance, we started a property management company. There are other organizations that have the ability to look at social enterprise at least and see if there's opportunities. But really, I think there's, some of the other things that were mentioned about just looking at what exists currently instead of always thinking about having to develop new.
And if I can actually bring a really totally different look on some of this, is for me, I think a lot of our housing stock is very old. I mean, we've been in existence for over 35 years, and a lot of those homes are 35 plus whatever they were when we first bought them. And so the housing stock there, while we can get supports from organizations to fix roofs and put in new driveways and do all the things that kind of help that building envelope. I think one of the things that I think that we're finding is empowering folks to have pride in their home. The fact that they could actually look at wanting to do their own maintenance, that wanting to do some of the work to their own place and maintaining the homes themselves. At this point, up until some of the things that I have seen was that people didn't feel like it was their home to do any kind of interior work of their own, do-it-yourself projects and things like that. And so a different lens to look at it is the relationship building with our tenants themselves, for them to feel like they have the ability to make positive changes to their environments, to speak up and make sure that they have a safe place that they can say, hey, this is what needs to get done, as opposed to that fear of potentially losing housing by complaining too much about some of the things that really should be fixed. That's one of the things I think I noticed when I first came on is people were living in conditions that they shouldn't have been living in, and nobody had taken notice, or they didn't feel like they could make the complaints. And so therefore the job then when I came in was way bigger than it needed to be. And it cost a lot more money than it needed to. And so I think that building up the relationships and empowering our folks to believe that they can have a say in the housing and the lifestyle that they're living, I think will impact greatly on the conditions of the houses for when they do decide to move on. So that's just another spin on that.
Thanks, all of you. It's interesting, in all of your responses, you've kind of gone through the different levels of at sort of how to address this question. And when you were speaking, Leanne, I was also just thinking about how many tenants are living in units with a landlord who is absent or doesn't address their needs. And does that create that sense of fear of, if I make too many requests for repairs, or the roof is leaking, I need you to fix this, it's dripping on my child's bed, and they're afraid if I complain too much, will I get evicted? So it's interesting, all these different pieces and different layers to that question. I'm going to move on to our final question, and this is sort of looking forward and trying to find some optimism in all of this. So let's imagine Cambridge had ample resources to adequately prevent the experiences of homelessness. What would that look like? What policies or resources would you want to see in the perfect world here in Cambridge? And that's for all of you, if anyone wants to take the first go.
Well, I wouldn't mind, since I raised the point about the lack of political will, I would say we need to start there. Like that, if we start there, then everything can trickle down. But that's what I would say. First and foremost, that we need to see some change at that level. And then I've forgotten what else I was going to say, but for me, that is the most important part. But then I think what we also want to see is we're going to have a continuum of options for people that are, in dire or imminent need of housing. So I know, we're working very hard as community partners trying to support the Y in their effort in terms of bringing a women's shelter to Cambridge. That's going to be really important. So that's going to materialize. And then, all of the targets and everything that we're all working so hard towards is also going to be materialized. So just the sector, there'll be a lot of opportunities made available, not just by nonprofits or service managers, but I also think we might see more partnerships with the, with for-profit and nonprofit coming together.
Playing chicken with the rest of you. Who wants to Go ahead, Kate.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I think in a perfect world, I think, you know, when I spoke to those upstream kind of solutions and a coordinated approach to into taking some accountability and addressing the needs and the voices of the community. So whether it's policies, resources, programs, I think rapid rehousing and an intervention to have folks quickly connected with housing services and have that addressed first, supporting with the barriers, like I mentioned earlier, having crisis and response systems in place. I think more outreach, more diversion programs, emergency shelters, interim housing, second stage, emergency, all of the housing, with coordinated approaches for referral and access so people can quickly, you know, get into that. Offering folks a wage, like Leanne was mentioning earlier, that's not only a living wage, but one that can support both rental and mortgage rates would be lovely. Enhanced employment opportunities and incentive programs to support ongoing and meaningful employment, I know is something that is brought up in our Small Steps program as well. And, you know, I'm always going to return to addressing GBV and IPV in meaningful ways. So I think prevention programming with children and youth from an early age to encourage those healthy relationships and coping, policies and legislations that are built on truly supporting and believing survivors is necessary. And we need to create systems where folks have ample access to what they need. So again, they're not being reliant on donations, but having the things that they need to sustain themselves and their families long term. And beyond the policies and the resources, and right here in the moment, I would love to see a change in the collective narrative, more empathy and understanding for the experiences of unhoused folks. I think many of us are closer to not having enough than we are to extreme wealth. And I would love to see a shift in that fear associated with homelessness, with shelters, and harm reduction in our community.
Thanks, Kate. I want to pull just for 1 second that thread you mentioned around gender-based violence and intimate partner violence and how important it is to this discussion. I think we know quite well now, at least those of us who are really immersed in the research, that lack of economic independence is one of the key reasons why people stay in unsafe homes. And that can't be ignored. And I know with the adoption of the right to housing, it was 2019, housing was declared a human right in Canada. If you are living in unsafe, inadequate, or otherwise not suitable housing, you are effectively homeless. And so really important, I think, to keep that centered. What does it mean to not have adequate and accessible housing? And how does that impact your life and ripple throughout every aspect of it? Thanks for all of those great points.
Can I just add one additional point, I think, and it
Please.
ties into the gender-based violence as well, is that access to justice for people who experience gender-based violence, access to justice for low-income tenants, so that they have a way to assert their rights if they have maintenance problems, if they're being evicted, if they're being harassed. So I think that supporting people in that sense is super important as well.
Absolutely. Leanne, anything that comes to mind for you?
I mean, what a bunch of great comments, and it's really hard to top any of that. But I think what I would suggest is there has to be ongoing support, and I think that we put roofs over heads and we help them look at that stuff, that ongoing support, that true follow-up, that really getting to the actual reasons on why anybody became homelessness in the first place, and mitigating the risk of that happening again, and really just that true follow-up of making sure that doesn't happen again. I think that too often it's more about housing focus, and that we just get people housed and not necessarily taking into consideration how they got to where they are. And true follow-up and really looking to make sure that these things don't happen again. Is key to a lot of people coming back in through the system. So
excellent point. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the experience of homelessness is, of course, a traumatic experience, and all the various reasons and factors that lead to someone becoming unhoused are, it's uncountable, but there's a lot of trauma there, and providing those wraparound supports isn't a nice to have. It is actually required to really truly assure that people find their ways into sustained and adequate housing. I think you've hit a really good point there, Leanne. We are at 9 minutes to 1. Does anyone have anything like they'd like to add? Or shall we see if we have any questions? I haven't been looking at the chat or the Q&A at all.
I
If
think
anyone,
there was a question in the chat that I just saw from Aaron Day about how municipalities are enacting provisions around the rent eviction issue, because most tenant laws are provincial, which means that the province has jurisdiction over that area. I think, Aaron, that what the municipalities are doing is they're trying to make the provisions, they're sort of designing them to be add-ons to the existing laws. So they're not, it doesn't conflict with the existing laws. It's just creating an additional layer of protection for tenants. So it may be saying to a landlord like that they need to try and find another unit for a tenant to live in if they need to renovate the unit, or it may be saying, you know, if the landlord is applying for a building permit, is a building permit necessary? Can they do the work while the tenant remains in the unit? Is there a way to minimize the amount of time that the tenant has to leave? Because the reality is that the way the system works is that if a landlord gets and if you know if the landlord is able to have the tenant move out because they're doing these renovations, we know that even though the tenant may have a right to come back into the unit once the renovations are done, in reality, that often doesn't happen. Either the tenant has had to sign a new lease at a much higher level of rent, and so they're locked in into another unit because their older unit is being renovated, or the tenant just doesn't know how to enforce those rights. And once they're out, if the landlord doesn't let them know when the renovations are finished, and if the unit gets rented out to someone else, that reasonably affordable rent is gone. So just creating some small additional protections can have some really big impact. And I think that's where most municipalities who are doing this, where they're how they're designing those provisions.
thanks, Shannon. Steve, if you want to come back on camera, I don't know if anyone said anything, tweeted anything for you, Steve, that you wanted to comment on or respond to. Not to put you on the spot, but you're welcome to chime in.
I agree with a lot of what folks have said. I mean, I feel like I got my opportunity to speak for 20 minutes straight.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I got my points in, but really appreciate hearing it. I feel like a lot of the context was quite illuminating from I think a lot of the stats I had. But if
Yeah,
anyone
it
has
was kind
questions,
of,
I'd be happy to answer them.
thanks, Steve. Yeah, I was sort of taking the data and putting it, showing it how it's coming up in real life. I really liked how that kind of worked out for us all. Michaela, I see your hand up. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, yeah. So my name's Bridget. I'm Michaela's outreach partner. We're just sharing the computer here. And I had a question kind of about that report. Or anyone can speak to it really, but forgive me, I haven't read the full report or anything, but I'm wondering if it talked about at all, like we talked about renters and stuff like that. Was there any research or charts about like landlords and land ownership, like trends of like these big conglomerate developers or whoever, like the trends in how much housing stock they have acquired, like basically like the flip side of the information that we were presented?
Good question.
Yeah, there's not too much of that, and part of that's because of lack of easy public availability. Like things like who owns buildings is not a readily accessible and easily aggregated data source. Like certainly, like there's been some we referenced a few pieces that we could see, like even to the point of like how many evictions are in there, like. The landlord tenant board doesn't really disclose that information readily. So it's not like we can easily say like what's the number of evictions by different causes over time. Like who are the folks who initiated those eviction requests? Like some of the folks that have done like more in-depth work through like various like particularly some investigative journalists or some researchers who did like they had to go a lot of steps to actually get some of those, and we did reference some of that briefly in the report. And like there's been some really good pieces by the Globe and Mail on eviction trends. There's some good pieces. I think the Toronto Star did some pieces of like some of the most predatory of folks purchasing and like how much rent goes up once they purchase a building on various units, and how many like as a not like a huge number necessarily of folks who are getting quite a huge portion of the purchases. And it's very profitable. Like if you can buy an old unit and raise rents by 75%, you're or more, like it's a very profitable endeavor, which is the unfortunate thing of like it works very well from a business model, and like a lot of them do it over and over again. So like it's just a couple folks who've really made that their business model, and we allude to some of that, but it's certainly not something we couldn't find a lot of local information on that. And
maybe that's one of the policy changes we can advocate for, is making all of that information more readily available. It's a good question. Bridget, you said, thank you so much.
there's some
Panelists,
things that are even like in terms of like, so there's information like like even things on like the census, like a lot of times like you want information like a lot of the things I was mentioning or like what we're presenting today is like, what's it look like in Cambridge? I can't necessarily tell you because like they don't bother to show it at Cambridge. They're just like, oh, the region of Waterloo is good enough. And I mean, when you're trying to make local policies, particularly in an environment that's changing very, very rapidly, like it is helpful to know like what's the difference in Cambridge versus Kitchener versus Waterloo, as opposed to an aggregate, or if particularly if some of the folks in the townships, like you can't get any of that information at all. And if they're trying to make local policies, like they have absolutely no information, even some of the really basic stuff that we talk about in our report.
yeah, especially when you live here and you actually do see how different it is between the cities and the townships. Yeah, it's a good point, Steve. Thank you. We are just about at time. Panelists, do anyone have any final parting words, or do you feel that you've got everything out that you wanted to share? Unmute if you have anything to say, but no pressure. Nope, Shannon.
I would just like to say, I think the point about the political will that Rebecca mentioned, I think is super important, and not just the political, like the will on the part of politicians, but the entire community to look at this as something that, when the most vulnerable people in our community are suffering, we should all be very concerned about that. And we should be, that we should be making that a priority issue in terms of, municipal budgets, and also, engaging with our province, the province and the feds in terms of additional resources for this, because I think it's just, the reality is it ends up costing our community so much in terms of all the spillover effects that happen when someone is experiencing homelessness, and the way it affects every part of their life, from their health to their family relationships, everything. So I think it's something that we really need to get our community behind, the idea that this has to be a priority.
Fabulous way to end things. Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you all of our panelists and Steve for being here for this fabulous conversation. Thank you to all of the audience too, who tuned in for another one of our sessions. Stay tuned. I mean, if you find the event poster, find all the organizations that are represented on this panel today. Everyone is doing incredible work. Stay tuned. Sign up for our newsletter if you can. Thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day, all of you.